Hello, everyone, and welcome to the industry stage at Fintech Talents North America. I'm Lisa Moyle, Director of Strategy at BC Innovations, and I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session, which will be looking at designing digital for all. It's a subject about which I am extremely passionate, and I know that my panel holds similar views. Before we pass over to them to introduce themselves, just to say if anyone watching has any questions or comments for the panel and wants to challenge something that we've said, agree, disagree, please post those in the chat and we'll do our best to respond to them. But for now, I'd like to pass over to Melissa Dranfeld. And Melissa, could you give us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is my first virtual speaking engagement, actually. I spent most of 2020 on parental leave, so this is quite a fun adventure. I live in Toronto. I work for one of the large banks in Canada, Scotiabank. We also have a very large presence in Latin America and the Caribbean, so you may know us from that part of the world if you're not close to Canada. And we are a bank that is about, I would say, 6 years into a pretty existential journey of change with respect to how we serve our customers digitally. It's been an awesome ride to be a part of that. And a big part of that journey is coming to terms with just how much we need to serve a diversity of customers through digital. And as we increasingly interact with our customers that way, there are new questions that we have the ability to ask about who our customers are, what they need from us, how we can provide service to them in ways we couldn't before without digital. And that presents a really interesting sort of backdrop to this conversation around who we're building for, how we need to respect them as individuals and as distinct customers. And that's a lot of how I get to spend my time leading customer experience digitally for the bank, which is a great privilege, a great pleasure. I have a wonderful team supporting me of mixed design professionals, whether that's in strategic foresight or user research or service design, or what we call customer advocacy, which in some organizations you might refer to as the voice of the customer. And we do really, really great work across our portfolio suite, advocating for the people that ultimately we're here to serve on their financial journeys.
Thanks for that, Melissa. And we're delighted that you're doing your first virtual event with us. So thank you. Over to you, Rob. You're a relatively new entrant in the space. Tell us about what you're up to.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Curtis, CEO and co-founder of Daylight. As you can tell, I'm an Aussie, and our company, Daylight, is the first and only digital banking platform designed specifically for the LGBT community. And you're probably wondering why LGBT folks need bespoke financial services support. Here's what we know. It costs more to be LGBT. And when we reach in to get help on healthcare, finance, and even things like accounting, what we find is that there's a lack of expertise in the industry that understand the unique needs that we have. And as a result, if you look ahead to our financial outcomes, LGBT people have lower rates of home ownership and are significantly less prepared for retirement. Now, banks have had a generation to prepare for our customers, and they failed. And so we've set out to create Daylight as the first and only digital banking platform designed to really understand the needs of LGBT consumers and to design products for them.
Thanks for that, Rob. Fantastic. And I'm sure we'll get into more detail about how you do what you do. And over to you, Michael. Tell us a bit about your work.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here as well. This is not my first virtual conference, however. So my name is Michael Sear. I'm with Regions Bank. We are a $150 billion bank located in the southeastern United States. We have 1,300 branches in 15 states, mostly concentrated in the Deep South. I work in customer strategy and insights, and I manage the bank's underserved customer segment strategy. We have a set of products and services designed for consumers that don't have a bank account. We directly compete with check cashers and payday lenders, and we are the largest consumer bank in the US that has this level of commitment to the underserved. I'm very proud of the work we do, both in branch and in digital, and I'm excited to be here to share it with y'all.
Thanks so much. And I want to start with a question that I'm going to put to all of you, because all of you touched on meeting the needs of particular communities, particular segments of customers. Is looking to the future, do you think that's what all customers should expect? Should they expect these highly tailored and personalized set of products and experiences? And what are some of the things that you would see as standing in the way of that goal? Some of them, there could be dangers, there could be ethical considerations with that high degree of personalization. And let's start with you, Michael, on that one.
This is a great question. I think from my perspective, dealing with underserved consumers, I'm of two minds. My first thought is, yes, of course, customers want a tailored, personalized solution. Like I said, we have a set of products that are designed for customers that don't have a deposit account, don't have a traditional banking relationship, rather than trying to fit everybody into a one-size-fits-all product. We meet them where they are on their financial journey. But working with the underserved and some of the things I know demographically about our segment, they skew younger, they over-index for women, they over-index for minorities. So something that makes me a little anxious is if you start designing products for a customer segment and it becomes shorthand for these are products for minority customers, I think that starts to become problematic. And if it makes me anxious, I know it would make bank compliance anxious.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think, Rob, this is a great one for you as well. And thinking about, you are designing, Daylight is designing for a particular community.
Indeed. And I'm probably going to come out with the strongest opinion here. I don't think any of our banks need to look the same. Our financial needs are really different. And if I can go into Facebook or Instagram or TikTok and I can get a curated list of content that's relevant to my need, why hasn't our industry as a whole not caught up? And I hear that there are ethical considerations for that, and I think those things can be addressed as friction rather than barriers. But here's the way that we look at it. If we were getting this right with a system that was designed effectively, that put equity into the hands of the entire community, we wouldn't have such an uneven degree of wealth. We wouldn't have so many clear pain points. And I think this is a very sympathetic audience of folks that are designing for underserved communities. But here's the thing, we shouldn't have to. These things should be designed in from the beginning to understand what the needs of our customers are and to be able to satisfy those needs. Because the sad reality is that if 50% of LGBT consumers can't develop a regular savings pattern because we've been born into a series of straight families, our parents don't know how to educate us, and our banks don't know who we are, I think the outcomes have to speak for themselves. And at the moment, the outcomes in my community are terrible. We all think of LGBT folks as being 2 incomes and no kids. This idea that actually because we're not spending money on school uniforms that we've got a huge amount of wealth. Now that's easy to think about, but that will be 2 white men probably, and they'll be living in coastal cities. What about the 20% of my community that are queer people of color, the 20% of queer people of color who don't have a bank account or are unbanked and underbanked? It shows how even in my own community, by building a single product that is designed for everybody, it's impossible for us to meet the needs and the unique circumstances of our customers. So personalization is an absolute must going forward from our perspective.
Thanks for that. You've made a powerful case. I can see you nodding your head, Melissa. Let's put this question over to you now.
Sure. I mean, to me, I think there are sort of 2 lanes to this conversation. One is the conversation that's about tailored products and services and sort of rooted in more of the identity politics space that we've been talking about for the past couple of minutes. But there's also the concept of actually personalized products and services, which means one-to-one, not one-to-segment. And that is an entirely different realm. That is an entirely different opportunity space, but also a space that is, rife with gaps, I would say, in user education around how their data is being used to provide personalized service. And I think that is a cost to the user that we are responsible to drive education around. We are responsible to help our customers understand what they are providing in order to receive personalized service. And that is something we take very seriously. It's a part of our ethical framework in how we build our products and services. I would say back to the sort of the identity politics portion of this conversation, I come back to a statement that our digital accessibility team and our inclusive design team champion for us all of the time, which is that we should not be designing for anyone without them. And that is a key part of our design process, to make sure that we are including the people for whom we are designing into our work and into our process for building on their behalf.
So kind of sticking with some of what you just said there, how do you ensure, what are some of the key considerations when you're designing digital experiences for your customers to ensure that no one is left out? I mean, Rob's pointed, for example, and so has Michael, to some customers who are clearly not being well served by their financial institutions.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to, but before I do, I wonder, Rob, did you want to jump in based on something I saw in the chat?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I missed that.
No, that's okay.
No
Go ahead, Rob. Sorry. Let's come back to you on the identity politics issue, because I think that's probably an important one for you to respond to.
I think the term identity politics is really loaded and political, and I don't think it's the right one. This isn't about politics. This is about the individual needs of my community. And I'm sure that wasn't the intention, but I think it's really important to understand that when the needs of a particular community are treated as identity politics, they're not taken seriously. The needs of individuals need to be taken seriously. And I just think it's worthwhile pointing out that the longer we think of LGBT financial uniqueness as being an identity politics issue, the further we are away from impacting the change that is going to be required.
No, thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. And that certainly wasn't my intent. I think what I was trying to differentiate was, as we think about communities of people that are rooted in identity, rather than, one-to-one personalization that's anchored in behavioral data through the technology.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. Thanks for the clarity.
It's already tricky terrain. Yeah, go ahead.
These conversations are really challenging, and I think they're healthy, and it's important for us to find ways to educate one another in our vocabulary, in our dialogue. It's all part of this process.
Absolutely. And I think when, we're talking about communities and, it's ultimately, for me, it's about understanding how structurally, culturally, historically, different, kind of needs have arisen and perhaps not been addressed. So I think that's a, fantastic point from the both of you. Melissa, picking up on what I was saying just before that, how do you, you're a large financial services provider in Canada and abroad. How do you ensure in that process that, you're picking up on the needs of different communities and, just not designing in a way that people, whether intentionally or not, are going to be left out?
Sure. And I would say, our organization and probably every organization out there is not perfect at this. There is a lot of ground to make up, and that's a journey that I'm really honored to be a part of. I would also say that the shape of what makes up a team in a bank today is very different from what it was 5 years ago. I joined Scotiabank in March 2015, so it's almost, to the day, it's almost 6 years ago. And at the time, the digital team was an idea, and it was something that the bank knew they needed to invest in, but really it didn't exist culturally in the organization. And the types of skill sets and the types of roles and the types of people who come from varied backgrounds, who come from varied industries, who have honestly quite very little attachment to banking as a discipline, but rather to their craft and to their profession as designers or product managers or engineers, we're excited to take on the challenge of turning a big ship, which is an entire journey in and of itself. What I would say about your question is, to me, it comes down to, in our work, our design process, and how do we make sure that our design process is inclusive every step of the way? How do we make sure that we're continually refining it, that we're poking holes in it every time we do a new piece of work? Things like user research, when we look at our recruiting practices and our recruiting partners for research participants, how do we make sure that there's representation appropriately in those recruiting pools? How do we make sure that we are dealing with bias in the synthesis process? How do we make sure that we are bringing in third-party voices into our work and into our refinement? And then on the other side, I would say a big part of what we've driven in the bank that I'm very proud of is including our customers in incomplete products and incomplete services in things like betas, and actually getting them to help us stamp out some of those things that should not be there, or identifying things that should and are missing.
Brilliant. I can see Rob's nodding his head, and Michael. Shall we pass over to you, Rob? Did you want to come back on anything that Melissa just said, or that you recognize in the process?
No, I think that's very much the right way to look at it, which is that the more you can integrate the culture within your organization with the culture of the people that you serve, the better you're going to do. One of the things we pride ourselves in at Daylight is that we're a team of queer millennials solving our own problems. That gives us the empathy to understand how deep to go. But it is almost impossible for somebody from outside of a culture and outside of a segment to really deeply understand the needs of that group without having to do a lot of legwork. There's no instinct, there's no real sense of intuition about what good looks like. And I think the more that leadership teams in banking organizations, employee resource groups can support diversity, and indeed the recruitment and makeup of the teams themselves reflect the diversity of their customers, it's only going to be a better, a competitive advantage for that bank.
And presumably that's why, that lack of diversity within a financial institution perhaps goes some way to explain why they weren't able to meet the needs of the community that you're looking to serve.
Yeah, that's right. So let me give you some examples. The KYC process is one that we're all really familiar with. We ask people for their identity. We then use whatever they provide in the KYC process to tell us huge amounts about that customer. Our identity system is broken for two reasons. Number one is a trans person who's going through a KYC process will suddenly find that they become an edge case. Why? Because of a failure of design and imagination. What the experience for a trans person going through KYC looks like this. They may be presenting a legal name that they've had the benefit of updating using often very convoluted and expensive processes. Only about 60% of trans folk have one piece of identity document in their name. But let's say they present in their preferred name. So not the name that they were born with, their dead name, but their real name. You put that into a tool that is designed to check a social security number against one set of gender and identity markers. That's great. But in the case of a trans person or a non-binary person who has made changes to those things, suddenly this system, which has been designed has been inadequately designed for this community, will throw those people out and will say, hang on a second, why is there one social security number but two names and two genders? Must be fraud. So from a design perspective, we're penalizing people in our community that are already marginalized because we failed to engage with them in the design process. And this stuff matters because often banks take the data that's used in KYC and they use that to refer to that customer forever. Now, it's really difficult to change this stuff. This is the thing that we find the most incredible. So my co-founder, Billy, she's a trans woman and she wanted to update her name at one of her banks, market leader. What she found was that she had to go to a doctor for permission, a lawyer, the courthouse 3 times, a notary. She presented all of this expensive and time-consuming documentation to the teller, and the teller cancelled her card, ordered her a new one with an updated first name. It's great. We shouldn't have subjected that person to such an unsafe and expensive process when they're already at the margins of our financial system. And then even then, every time she logs into her account, it's pulled off of the data that we provided during KYC. So she has to log in with her dead name, receive statements in her dead name, get text messages and customer support in her dead name, which has already notified them that her name has changed and her gender has changed. Now, we figured out as a community how to allow women to change their surname because in many cultures that is an important part of getting married, but we've never managed to figure out how to help a trans person change their first name and their gender. And this stuff really matters because it's an example of how if you don't include the right voices into a design process, and you assume that everybody looks like you, you're going to get it wrong. Daylight's really, really different. We've designed from the ground up for the needs of our community. So if I use that very example, a trans person who signs to Daylight goes through a really simple process. They provide their legal documentation for KYC. They get the opportunity to tell us how they'd like to be referred by, their full name, and they give us their updated pronouns, because actually we don't need to know their gender. It doesn't have a determination as to what we sell them, because actually gender is no longer a binary construct anyway. And so people that fall to the old binary world of male and female are going to continue to fail on personalization generally. And so Billy, using Daylight, can order a card in her name, and indeed many trans folk change their name a few times as they're trying to figure out a new identity. And so rather than send her to the courthouse and a lawyer and a doctor and a judge every time, we have built that in an inclusive design thing from the ground up. And I think this is an example of how when you design products with communities, with expertise and empathy, and we stop marginalizing people that don't fit within 2 standard deviations of average, then you start to get products that we think are really, really powerful. Because presenting with a card that is in the wrong gender or the wrong name for a trans person, and remember, only 60% of them have one form of legal identity in that form. What happens is if you present that at point of sale, 30 to 40% of trans folk are subjected to abuse, questions, accusations of financial crime. Because why should your name look different to how you present? And so the knock-on impacts that can happen when you don't design for communities can be really life-threatening, because you don't want a trans woman at 11 o'clock at night at the 7-Eleven being subjected to high rates of violence already to have created a pain point in the finance system. And we see this all the way through. That person, when they change their name, has no credit record anymore because we've not figured out how to design that. And even if they do, they present that to an employer or a landlord, and we've outed them as a trans person. And guess what? Some people don't want to employ trans people, and some people don't want them to live in their buildings. And this is an example of how a failure of design can have consequential impacts that are outside of our immediate world. And I think this is where diversity of thinking and inclusion of communities that are going to be impacted in the design process can avoid the unintended consequences that I'm sure nobody here wanted to have created in the first place.
Yeah, no, that is a fantastic example of how that lack of understanding and outdated architectures underpinning that have those detrimental knock-on effects that you outlined so clearly. Michael, let's go over to you, because you work with communities who, not the same issues, but issues probably also around identity, lack of access. Do you want to build on some of what Rob was saying there, reflecting on your own work and your own communities?
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of parallels. As I said, most of the unbanked and underserved customers tend to tell us like they don't feel welcome by banks. They don't think banks want their business. They feel judged when they come into a bank to ask for certain types of transactions, and they very well may be, right? We historically taught bankers that the most important thing you can do is sell checking accounts, and anybody that falls outside of that is not valuable use of your time. One of the things we've done at Regions that I'm particularly proud of is we had an account recommendation tool where you would ask a customer certain questions and it would tell them what the best fitting account for them would be. And last year, we were able to expand that account recommendation tool. We have branded it Green Print. Regions color is green, so like your blueprint, this is your green print. And we've included a lot more questions about how you manage your money versus how you manage a checking account. And this makes it a lot more inclusive and a lot more valuable for customers that maybe don't fit into a traditional banking profile. We also added questions around financial health and wellness. So things like, do you pay most of your bills on time, some of your bills on time, all of your bills on time? Do you spend more than your income more than expenses? Is income less than expenses? And then that allows the banker to do a deep dive. And when we talk about personalization and customization, sometimes it's not just a product fit, but it's working with someone on their financial journey. What will it take to move you from pay some of your bills on time to most of your bills on time? We have some we have some guidelines around that with improving a credit score, for example. Like, we all kind of know intuitively, like, if you want to improve your credit score, you need to pay your bills on time. You need to not apply for a lot of credit, right? There are certain things. These other types of financial health questions, planning, saving, borrowing, and being financially healthy, what are the things we can do? What are the tactics that a banker can work with a customer, a personal coaching plan to move them, along on their financial journey and make them more healthy? So it's very personalized, very customized to the individual, even if a lot of the product sets are the same. It's just different use cases depending on a customer's specific set of needs.
Fantastic. And it sounds like, that's a great example again of understanding. It's not necessarily reinventing the wheel and it's a whole new product, but delivering people what they need in a way they can understand, and then building on that trusted relationship that they're developing with you. Melissa, let's have you come back on this, because this must feed into some of the ways you're thinking about more inclusive design for your customers.
Sure. And I would say the area in which we have made the most progress as a design team and as a bank has been around inclusive design for our community of users of all abilities, where you might think about, physical or cognitive disabilities. And we have actually made great progress in not only building applications that are more conducive to independence and agency and success for our customers of all abilities, but we've also actually made great strides in including more members of that community into our team. And we're super proud of that. So for example, I can tell you one of the most fabulous people on our team is visually impaired. And he is just as much a part of our design team, although he is fully blind and has never seen what the application looks like. He interacts with it in very unique ways that are set up so that he can be successful. When we redesigned our mobile application which was launched about a year and a half ago now, that was a key goal for us, was to make sure that the mobile application was 100% usable for anybody who had a disability that would previously impede them from acting on their own behalf with agency and independence in digital. And so, you might look at the dimensions of a mobile screen, and you might say that actually a person who has full range of motion in their hand can probably use most of that screen, but a person who has limited motion of their fingers and of their wrist may only be able to use a portion, usually the sort of the lower left-hand portion of that screen. And how do we make sure that all of the key tasks and features that a person might need in order to progress through their journey in the application are at reach for them? Or how do we make sure that key moments in a transaction, for example, are clear and definitive for a user if they cannot see the screen? So one great example is if you are sending a payment or if you're sending an Interac e-transfer, when that payment is complete, you now also don't only get a visual cue, but you get haptic feedback through the phone, and you get audio feedback through a sound that's designed into the application. So how do we make sure that those kinds of things are incorporated into the customer experience from the start rather than built later? And I would say that's the space we're most proud of, but we are excited to continue to serve more and more communities in that way.
Yeah, those are also some great examples. And I'm also interested to hear from all of you is, how do you take those lessons? I mean, the example that Rob gave of his co-founder and all the steps that she had to go through and all the knock-on effects, for example, in this case, trans people may experience by, all of those barriers in their way to proving, something which for most of us is very straightforward, our identity. How do you take those learnings, right? So Michael, let's go to you on this one. Everything that you've learned from the behavior and the responses and the way that the people you're serving who are currently underserved are responding to those products. Do you take that back into the larger organization? And there must be positive effects for the other consumers that you serve from those learnings.
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the biggest learnings that we have as a bank, because we work with underserved and unbanked customers, is how many of our customers that appear fully banked if you just look at their account profile, are using alternative financial services outside of the banking system. And now that we offer those, are coming into the fold, and we have a better understanding of their full financial picture. So if you have a customer whose account is overdrawn, they don't want to make a deposit because it will have to go to pay off the overdrawn balance. So they go to a check casher to get immediate access to funds in a check because they don't want to run it through the bank. And we would not have any visibility into that if we were not serving underserved customers that primarily use check cashing. Now that we have this service and we can offer it to everybody, now we have a better idea of what customers that, again, on paper might appear to be a very traditional fully banked customer, checking account, savings account, credit card, but we don't know what struggles they may have that the bank couldn't meet because when they go outside the bank, our bank, we don't have any visibility into what they're doing or using.
I think that's a super example because we tend to treat people who go to check cashing places where we know they're going to pay more, or even to payday lenders, as somehow being irrational or not properly informed, where in fact they're just used because they're not getting them from their own institution. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, Melissa. Let's go over to you. You wanted to come back on that, I believe.
Sure. One of our research teams actually did a really large piece of work in partnership with a local university on the entire industry of payday loans and cash checking industry. And what was fascinating about that is the assumptions you might hold about who these people are who leverage those services are in fact very, very untrue. There are quite a number of users for those services who make six figures, and they have been unable to develop healthy financial habits, and they end up into a recursive loop where cash flow for them is a problem, despite what many people would consider to be a very steady income. And so I think that it's really only through unpacking, through observation, through engagement, through inclusion in the conversation, what this demographic actually means, as opposed to what might be apparent at first glance when you look at transaction data or you look at visits or site information, for example. There's actually a really interesting behavioral layer to sort of unpack that reveals new opportunities for, market entrants and small players and disruptors, as well as established entrants to better serve those communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I wanted to pick up on, and I think, Rob, you mentioned this in your opening remarks when you were talking about some of the things that inspired you and your co-founder to set up Daylight, is around financial literacy and understanding, right? So, I mean, that varies across, communities, individuals, it's a challenging area to get people to take that information on. Do you think that good design can help support greater financial literacy and understanding for your customers?
Absolutely. And I think I just want to elevate the conversation around design away from functional design, because both Melissa and Michael have highlighted examples of where they're doing really important work around functionally designing for particular use cases and communities. But one thing Michael said that was really interesting was around how unbanked and underbanked people don't feel welcome in traditional financial institutions. And we think of design about the experience for the customer end to end. That includes being seen visibly in your marketing materials, onboarding in a way that's respectful for your personal circumstances, as we've described how we approach that for our particular community. But education is a big part of that. And so, we are often asked, why should people need an LGBT bank? And well, there's actually the alternative question that people should be asking is, why should they want it? And I'll give you an example of an event that we have designed that's coming up around tax time that is hopefully to give you a bit of a flavor about how we answer that question directly. So what a drag queen, an Instagram influencer, a financial coach, and a sex worker have in common is they need to handle their taxes as freelancers. They'll have expenses for doing that. they're probably never going to be feeling welcome at a traditional institute. So when we are running our tax time event, we are bringing a sex worker, an Instagram influencer, a drag queen, and a financial coach up on stage to listen to their stories about how they manage their money. Because actually what we've done is we'll be feeding financial education into a group of people that already probably feel marginalized. And these don't necessarily have to be LGBT folks, because all of those industries are, that's all work that people are doing of a really, really wide group outside of our own community. But they won't feel necessarily welcome to taking off-the-shelf tax advice. So what we're going to do is we're going to take an opportunity to go with deep cultural relevance, entertainment, and education at the same time, because I can get more people to turn out to a tax event that's going to have some interesting stories associated with it than I will ever get on a vanilla financial inclusion or a vanilla tax education event. And I think you have to think deeply culturally relevantly for the communities that you're serving, and be willing to take some risks and know that maybe it feels a little bit less palatable to be talking about some of those challenging topics. But fundamentally, that's work. These are customers. These are real people who have the needs that your company can provide. And so we have to design around the entire experience, not just the functional pain points, but the emotional ones as well.
Yeah, that really puts it into a really powerful context there. Melissa, let's go to you and then to Michael, because I know you both have thoughts on this subject as well.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think the traditional approach to financial literacy has often very been separate from the actual activity of banking or the activity of conducting my finances. I'm in doing mode or I'm in learning mode. And I think that there's a real flaw in separating those things out for many people, because the reality is most of us have to do some form of financial work for our well-being on a regular basis. And there are missed learning moments in all of those interactions. And so our approach is increasingly that we can look at helping to drive, I wouldn't say only financial literacy, but I would say financial acumen and financial empowerment for our users through their interactions, through their tasks in the applications. And how do we incorporate their micro-learning opportunities in doing mode rather than just in learning mode?
Great, thanks. And Michael?
I just think there's so much to say on the topic of financial education. It is, I think it's super important, but I don't think it is an end unto itself. We focus a lot on educating people or teaching them about products and services, but if the reason you can't pay all your bills on time is because your pay is volatile and there's a lot of variability from paycheck to paycheck, and they don't always line up your ins and outs, there's no amount of alerts or automated bill payments that are going to fix that problem, right? That's a completely different scenario. So it's not like educating yourself on how to make a budget. That's a different problem. So I think sometimes we want to teach people financial education so that they can talk about what an interest rate is or how to get a mortgage or how to read a credit report. But really, there's much more tactical stuff that you can, that a personal banker, a financial coach can work with the customer to solve the problems that an individual is facing that are unique to them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Often we act as if people are in financial difficulty because somehow they don't understand financial products, and that's clearly not the case. Over to you, Rob. I think you wanted to come back on something.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the behavioral science, actually education doesn't really move the dial in terms of financial outcomes. There's lots of literature that shows that. And so I think when we think of education as being one and done, and that's all we have to do is just give people the tools that they need or the education they need, in practice we act irrationally all the time. We'll buy that thing that's a little bit more expensive because of a perception of quality. We know that we should pay this bill on time, or we should invest our money or save a little bit more. We don't act as rational beings, and I think the behavioral science shows that that's the case. We've taken a different approach, which is using behavioral science in an interesting way. So LGBT folks experience shame to a high degree because we're shamed when we're kids. And money is another area that people feel shame. And so when you have those two things coming together, people aren't going to learn from one another, and they're not going to engage in financial services, particularly on the advisory side if they don't feel like that advisor is going to help them. So we've taken a different approach. A user on Daylight can create a savings goal. And when they do that, they have the option to share that into a community feed of other folks that are creating savings goals themselves, to cheer each other on and even to contribute to each other's goals. And why I think that's important is we have been astounded to find that 1/3 of our savings accounts have been created for economic resilience. We're talking emergency funds and buffers. And this didn't start until we introduced our social feed, and one person put something up in a shame-free way saying that they were saving for an emergency buffer. None of us want people to know that we're living close to the breadline, so we're not going to necessarily feel proud of that. Now 1/3 of our accounts, from that one moment of being sharing something that's very simple, but building social norming around it, translated to up to 1/3 of our accounts being in support of financial resilience. And I think there are lots of tools that we can apply just beyond traditional education, leading particularly into behavioral science, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that is incredibly interesting. And I want to pass to Michael and Melissa in a sec on their final thoughts around how behavior is driving the design or informing the design. And I don't know if nudge is the right word, but you're leading people in a direction that will build financial wellness, build financial resilience. Michael, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many things from a behavioral standpoint that we can do to help customers, to Rob's point, make maybe more logical decisions. The example I think of that we've worked on is around credit card payments, especially with our secured card, which again is very popular with credit challenged folks. But it's setting up not just an alert system, but setting up when you go to make your payment, the order in which we present your payment options. Do we suggest the minimum payment first? Do we suggest the full balance, which may be overwhelming first? Or do we present payments where we say, if you pay this amount, you have it paid off in 2 years. If you pay this amount, it will be paid off in 5 years. Giving people choices when they make a payment, maybe asking them, do you want to round it up to an from the minimum to an extra, to an even 100? Like, these are the types of things that can make a big difference in someone's financial health, that everyone's busy, everyone's working real hard to manage their whole life. They don't want to spend a whole lot of time thinking about their finances. So if we can add those little nudges, they can make a big impact on somebody's financial journey.
Fantastic. And I could talk about this all day, but we are sadly running out of time. So Melissa, I'm going to pass over to you on a final word on, thinking about behavior and leading people in the right direction.
Sure. Well, my first thought is that I don't believe there is a right direction. I think everyone's definition of prosperity is unique. And, what I believe to be a prosperous life is different from what Michael believes to be a prosperous life, and Rob and yourself. And I think it's our role to accept the fact that we actually don't get to choose that for the customer, and to figure out how to become an enabler in a multitude of journeys for customers, and to create a platform that actually that distributes the agency back to the customer so that they can make those decisions. They can develop financial plans and financial habits that are supportive of their goals, that are supportive of their income. As you said, Michael, income variability is huge. I think that's only going to increase as the gig economy swells in the coming years. I think, the lifestyle goals and the goals that we have for how we spend our discretionary income is deeply personal and deeply, different, I would say, from what would be considered a standard. And so I think that the more that we can do to create components for the user that are a part of their journey, the better off we're going to be as being a part of that journey, and then hopefully continue to earn their business.
I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up our discussion, because it comes across as far more empowering than us thinking about how we're going to teach people to do the right things. So So thanks for that, Melissa. Michael, I know it wants to steal that line around we don't get to decide
Totally.
what financial success looks like for a customer. And I'm going to steal it too. So thank you again to my panel. You've been fantastic. For everyone else, keep your questions coming in the chat and stay with us on the industry stage for more great content. And thanks again to Michael, Rob, and Melissa.
Thank you so much, everyone. Nice chatting with
Thanks,
you.
everyone.